Blood-curdling facts that you wish you never knew. Part 34. In 2008, Bruce Pardo snuck into his ex's Christmas party and torched it with a gift-wrapped flamethrower. These 5 Australian children were playing in a bouncy castle when suddenly it was lifted 30 feet in the air by a gust of wind. Unfortunately, they were thrown out of the castle mid-air and plummeted to their deaths. A mother named Heather Pingle died after saving her 4-year-old son from a pit bull. During the fight, she was able to wrap a cord around the dog and strangle it, but not before losing both of her arms and a significant amount of blood. In 1992, a 79-year-old woman purchased a McDonald's coffee, but accidentally spilled it on her lap and suffered third-degree burns. She ended up suing the company, arguing the temperature was far too high, and ended up winning $3 million.
She murdered her mother when she found out her big secret. On March 2020, 23-year-old Sydney Powell beat her mother up with a frying pan and then stabbed her more than 30 times because she found out that she got kicked out of school. Sydney was a student at Mount University in Ohio, and on this day, she attacked her mother while she was on the phone with her school. 50-year-old Brenda Powell, who was a child specialist at Akron Children's Hospital, was first attacked with a frying pan and then was stabbed in the neck and later passed away in the hospital. The defense argued that Sydney loved her mother and she had schizophrenia and therefore she could not be held accountable for what she had done. However, a psychologist brought in by the prosecutors disagreed with this and said that Sydney was well aware of what she was doing when she committed the crime. Sydney Powell was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison.
You have to be careful picking up stuff off the ground. So in the early 1960s, a family of 4 moved into a house in Mexico City. And one day the 10-year-old son is playing out in the yard when he sees something small and shiny on the ground. He doesn't really think anything of it, he just picks it up and puts it in his left pant pocket. But then over the next couple days, the boy starts getting sicker and sicker, and the skin on his left side near his pocket is starting to burn. His mom finds the capsule on him and ends up putting it in a kitchen cabinet with a bunch of other glasses. But over time, the glasses start all turning black. Not only that, but the fingernails of everyone in the family also start turning black. The boy and his family start getting sicker and sicker until one by one, most of the family dies. And this all started happening when the capsule came into the house. So what was the thing the boy found on the ground? It was a stray capsule of cobalt-60, which is incredibly radioactive, similar to what fell off a truck in Australia in January. If you want to hear more terrifying stories of radiation, you can check them out on the podcast this week.
Who would have thought that a hug could save a life? On October 2018, Hannah was 25 weeks pregnant when she went into labor and gave birth to her twin boys 15 weeks early. Since the twins were extremely premature, they had to stay in the hospital for weeks to be monitored, and Dylan began getting better, but his brother Daniel was not. Dylan was eventually able to be taken off the ventilator and was able to go home, but his brother was still in critical condition and they thought that he wasn't going to make it. When the twins were 14 weeks old, Dylan was taken back to the hospital to say goodbye to his brother, so the nurses put them together in the incubator, and that's when things took an unexpected turn. After spending 5 minutes together, Daniel's condition suddenly stabilized, but the next day it began deteriorating again, so the nurses suggested bringing back Dylan to spend more time with his brother. And once again, Daniel's condition stabilized and he was taken off the ventilator. Daniel eventually survived, and doctors called this a miracle but were confused and could not explain it.
A woman who was missing for 30 years was just found alive in Puerto Rico. So Patricia Kopta vanished without a trace from her home in Pennsylvania in 1992. The situation surrounding her disappearance was a little strange and scary because Patricia's mental health had been getting worse and worse over the years. So when she disappeared, the police told her younger sister and husband that they thought she left on her own accord and basically closed the case. They thought that she would maybe come back, but then 30 years went by with no phone calls and no contact. Everyone in her life had assumed she passed away. But recently, an 83-year-old woman in an elderly home in Puerto Rico started opening up to a nurse for the first time. The woman had been diagnosed with dementia and started bringing up things in her life that she had never spoken about before. This alarmed one of the nurses at the facility, who contacted authorities to get a DNA test because she started believing that this woman was a missing woman from the United States. And sure enough, it was Patricia. She had never told anyone about her previous life and had never contacted her family. Her husband and sister were contacted because they're still alive and they were shocked.
Jurors on this case were so haunted by the crime that they needed trauma therapy. In March 2018, 38-year-old Veronica Youngblood from Virginia was arrested. On the night in question, she had given her daughters gummies laced with a sleeping aid. Her daughters were 5-year-old Brooklyn and 15-year-old Sharon. The mother of two then shot both of her daughters. Horrifically, Sharon did not instantly die. She was actually able to ring police and explain to them that her mum had shot them both. When jurors on the case were played this 911 call, they were so distressed that they actually needed therapy. The teenager was taken to hospital where she sadly passed away. It transpired that Veronica had called her ex-husband after the killings and told him that she hated him. She also told him what she'd done. It's believed that her motive for this hideous crime was revenge over him. He'd actually been planning to move away to Missouri with Brooklyn the following weekend. Following her trial, Veronica was sentenced to 78 years in prison.
I killed and ate 11 people during my life. Don't stay until the end if you are sensitive. My name is Tamara Samsolova, the Russian murderous grandmother. I was an elderly woman residing in Russia, and over the years I committed unimaginable atrocities. I took the lives of several innocents in various and horrible ways. I poisoned, suffocated, and dismembered my victims using 2 sharp knives and a saw, often while they were still alive. I even boiled the head of one of them, a manifestation of the darkness within me, an irrepressible desire to sow terror. One day, my horrors were brought to light. Investigators found overwhelming evidence linking me to the murders I had committed. I was arrested and brought to justice. During my trial, I listened to the heartbreaking testimonies of the victims' families. I saw the pain and grief I had sown. Yet, despite all this, I couldn't help but feel a certain satisfaction, a kind of perverse pride. Eventually, I was found guilty of my crimes and sentenced to life in prison. Today, my story remains a dark chapter in Russian criminal history. People wonder how an apparently harmless grandmother could turn out to be a ruthless killer. Subscribe and tell me in the comments the next story you want to see.
There has been a huge breakthrough in the case of this missing mother of 5. On the 3rd of July 2015, Crystal Rogers vanished. Her boyfriend Brooks Hook told investigators that the pair had gone to sleep together at his family farm in Kentucky. When he woke up, he states that the mother of 5 had vanished. Months later, Brooks was named as the prime suspect. Interestingly, his brother Nick was fired from the police for interfering with the investigation. Terrifyingly, a year after the disappearance, tragedy struck again. At this point, it was November 2016. Crystal's dad, Tommy Ballard, was shot and killed while hunting with his son and grandson. He had been shot in the chest from behind. He'd been a huge part of the search for Crystal, and he just wouldn't rest until she was found. Tommy's case remains unsolved. Now, Crystal has been missing for 8 years, and although her body has not been found, police state that she is presumed dead. Now, Brooks has been arrested in connection with the case. The now 41-year-old faces charges of murder and tampering with physical evidence. He is being held on a $10 million bond. On the 7th of September, another arrest was made of 32-year-old Joseph Lawson. Joseph is charged with conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with physical evidence.
The author of this essay titled How to Murder Your Husband was actually convicted of murdering her husband. So this is self-published author Nancy Brophy. She was found guilty of murdering her husband, Daniel Brophy, in 2018. So Nancy was an author, and a lot of her work revolved around romance. Specifically, she published titles like this: The Wrong Cop, The Wrong Husband, The Wrong Brother. And like I said before, in 2011, she actually wrote an essay that was published titled How to Murder Your Husband. In the essay, she describes various methods that you could use to kill your husband and get away with it. And in the essay, there's a desire that she presents to never get caught. But as it turns out, in 2018, Nancy actually murdered her then husband Daniel, who was a chef in Portland. On June 2nd of that year, he was prepping for his daily work at the Culinary Institute in Portland when he was shot. Now, according to prosecutors at the eventual trial, there was a life insurance policy that Nancy craved a payout from. There were money problems between her and her husband, and that's what drove Nancy to murder him. I mean, I don't think you could possibly find something more ironic than this. In 2011, this woman writes an essay about how you can murder your husband and get away with it, and then years later, less than a decade later, she actually murders her husband, but she doesn't get away with it. Now, eventually Nancy was sentenced to life in prison, and at the end of the day, this seems like one of those stories that's just unbelievable, but it's true.
These three brothers are being remembered as loving, funny little boys. Having three young sons myself, this one really hits hard. So, trigger warning here, if you haven't heard of this story yet, it is really hard to listen to. The Doan boys were full of giggles, and their laughter was contagious. They were 3, 4 and 7 and often walked hand in hand, whether that was down to the water to fish or out to the garden to hunt for worms. On June 15th, 2023, Hunter, Clayton and Chase had their lives taken from them by the one person that should have been there to protect them, their own father. In an attack that he'd planned out for months, Chad Doan took his 3 boys out to the backyard and shot them one by one, execution style. At one point, one of the boys managed to flee to the woods outside their home, and Chad hunted him down, dragged him back to the yard, and shot him. The boy's mother had bravely tried to save them. She tried to grab the gun from Chad, and she was shot through the hand. The boy's older sister had actually run out into the road, shouting that her stepdad was killing everybody. A passerby came across her and dialed 911. When emergency services arrived, they were met with a scene that they could never have prepared for. All 3 boys were laid out on the lawn, and Chad was sat on the doorstep of the property. He was handcuffed while everybody tried desperately to save the boys' lives. All 3 boys, sadly, were pronounced dead at the scene. Chad was arrested and charged with 3 counts of aggravated murder, and his bond has been set to $20 million. He's set to appear in court for a preliminary hearing on June 26th. A memorial is being held this Sunday at the New Richmond Youth Ball Fields in Ohio to remember the 3 boys and to also thank first responders that tried desperately to save their lives.
This woman created such disturbing videos that she was sentenced to 50 years in prison. This story is truly one of the worst things that I've ever covered here on TikTok, so if you have a weak stomach or you can't hear about animal cruelty, please keep scrolling. So this is Ashley Richards from Houston, Texas. In 2015, she pleaded guilty to 4 counts of producing and 1 count of distributing these disturbing videos. And once again, I'm going to warn you, you can keep scrolling at any time before we get into these details. So this all started in 2012 when PETA, or the group known as People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, contacted the Houston police about a video they had found online. This film was titled Ebony Kill Cat, and it depicted extremely sadistic and cruel acts being forced upon a kitten. So the police got into contact with the people from PETA, and they then sent them 20 additional videos. These videos depicted the sadistic torture of various animals, including kittens, a fish, pigeon, crayfish, mice, a rabbit, all being tortured with different things like high heels, knives, screwdrivers, and pliers. In the videos, the woman that appeared in them was wearing a Mardi Gras style mask, and she would talk suggestively to the people watching this torture. Yes, that meant that there were paying customers out there that were paying this woman to produce these absolutely horrific videos. I cannot share the details of some of these videos. You can actually find the information online through news articles, but I mean, I think I changed as a person after reading these articles. Eventually, though, the police were able to track Ashley's IP address, which led them to her suburban home in Houston. This is an example of one of the messages she shared with the client. I mean, just, ugh. That led them to Brent Justice and Ashley Richards. These were the 2 that were producing these videos and selling them on a website online. And Congress had recently passed a bill making this specific type of video material, otherwise known as crush, illegal. So thankfully they were arrested. Shockingly though, Brent Justice, after the trial, he was actually sentenced to 50 years in prison. Shockingly though, Ashley, the woman who actually carried out these acts on camera, was only sentenced to 10 years in prison. Now, personally, this is one of the most disturbing things I've ever read about, and I definitely think she should have been in prison for a lot longer, but that's the justice system.
Murdered by someone he thought was a friend, 15-year-old Nick Votechnik lived in Taylorsville, Utah, at his grandparents' house. Nick had recently lost both of his parents, his mother in 2019 to cancer, and then his father in 2020 to a heart attack. He's described by his sister Samantha as a kind soul who is now her protector in the sky. This is what she sent me when I asked what he was like. Please pause to read. In May 2021, Nick had been hanging out with his friend Rowdy Lee Aguilar. They entered Rowdy's house, but only one of them came back out alive. On May 26th, Rowdy's father came across a rubbish bag in a utility trailer on the property. When he looked inside that bag, he found a human torso. Subsequently, more rubbish bags were found in a field near the house, and those bags also contained body parts belonging to that torso. They were found to be the remains of Nick Vtechnik. Footage from Rowdy's home showed Rowdy and Nick both arriving at Rowdy's house and going inside. It then showed Rowdy coming back out with some rubbish bags, and Nick was nowhere to be seen. Rowdy was questioned by police, and at first he denied any knowledge of knowing where Nick was. He said he'd been at his girlfriend's house all day, but when confronted with the footage and also the blood that was on his clothes and shoes, he confessed and said that it was him that had killed Nick. Nick had been stabbed a total of 26 times. One of those stab wounds had gone straight through his skull. Another had severed his carotid artery. This was the wound that was fatal. Rowdy was charged with aggravated murder and desecration of a human body, yet he is still to stand trial. Rowdy is currently being held at the Juvenile Detention Centre in Salt Lake City, and his trial has been pushed back to May 2024. His father is currently paying out-of-state professionals to try and have him deemed legally insane. This usually means a lighter sentence, and while he's waiting for his trial, he's free to see his family and get visits from them. Meanwhile, Nick's family have been left absolutely devastated by their loss. I'll tag Samantha's account below, and the family would really appreciate your support.
My daughter gave birth to my 7 children. My name is Joseph Fritz, and this is my terrible story. I built a secret basement under my house in Austria. There, I locked up my own daughter Elizabeth for 24 long years. I was a manipulative, domineering father. No one could have guessed what was going on in that basement. I led a double life. A normal husband and father on the top floor, and a monster in the secret basement. During the years I spent with that basement, I committed atrocities against my own daughter. Elizabeth had 7 children. 4 of them grew up with her in that secret basement, while the other 3 lived upstairs with my wife and me, unaware of the truth. But in 2008, everything changed. One of the girls was born in the basement because Austin became seriously ill. I had to take her to the hospital, but I didn't know that would be the beginning of my downfall. The doctors asked questions. The police and media began to investigate. My terrible secret was revealed. The basement in which I had locked my daughter and children was discovered. In 2009, I was sentenced to life imprisonment. I'm now behind bars where I can't do anything to anyone. My story has shocked the world, and many people wonder how such a crime could go unnoticed for so long.
The story of Steven Stainer, the boy who disappeared at 8 years old and returned 7 years later. One day, while walking home from school, Steven Stainer was taken into a car. The man brought Steven home and told him that his parents had let him stay the night. That was just the beginning of the 7-year brainwashing that this child would undergo. Steven was given a new name, Dennis, and was even enrolled in schools throughout the next years of his life. According to his teenage friends, he had a pretty normal social life. Everyone thought he was just a normal teenager until one day he broke down in tears. He said he wanted to go home and he missed his family. This is the man who took Steven. His name was Kenneth Eugene Parnell. Throughout the years of Steven's kidnapping, he was sexually molested by this man. Sadly, none of his friends knew it. When Parnell would sense that Steven was getting too close to his friends, he would pick up and relocate. Later, Steven would say in his testimony that Parnell actually tried to get Steven to assist in other kidnappings. Being the good kid that he was, he never assisted. Till one day, Steven returned home from school, and Parnell says to him, "Happy Valentine's Day, meet your younger brother." Parnell had kidnapped a young boy by the name of Timothy James White. Steven knew that he couldn't let what happened to him happen to this young boy. This dude took action. Parnell would be gone regularly for work, so one day while he was gone, he picked up Timothy and fled in the night. Him and Timothy hitchhiked several miles on a desolate road in the night, until he was picked up by a car who took him to the nearest police station. At this point, Timothy James White was all over the news. So when Stephen arrived at the police station, he told police that this was indeed the missing boy. During the police investigation, police asked for his name, and he said that all he knew was that his name was Stephen. He proceeds to tell them that he was also kidnapped by Parnell several years ago. The story made national news and the media was all over it. Stephen and Timothy were safe. Parnell would soon be arrested, and Stephen returned to his family. But the story is far from over. So this guy only served 5 years before being granted parole. This was due to the statute of limitations. At this point, Stephen moved on and even met a lady with whom he would soon start a family. Just as Stephen's family was beginning to think that they could move on, things take an insane twist. It involves the made-for-TV movie, titled after his famous words, "I know my first name is Stephen." It also involves this man, seen standing behind Stephen during his media interviews. Part 2 to come.
I bet you didn't know the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is based off true events. I am Bubba Sawyer, but you may know me as Leatherface. I was born into a deranged family of cannibals and sadistic killers living in a remote Texas farmhouse. My mother was a quiet woman, but my father was a monster. He was an abusive alcoholic who would beat my mother and us kids whenever he got the chance. As a child, I was always fascinated with the animals that my father would bring home to slaughter. I would watch as he killed them, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the beginning of my descent into madness. One day, my father brought home a chainsaw. It was a massive tool, and I was in awe of it. I begged my father to let me use it, and he eventually gave in. From that moment on, I was hooked. I would spend hours on end, cutting through trees and anything else that I could find. The sound of a chainsaw was like music to my ears. It was my escape from the reality of my life. But it wasn't until my father died that I truly lost my mind. I inherited his house, and I turned it into my own personal slaughterhouse. I would lure people in and kill them using my trusty chainsaw to do the deed. The screams of my victims were like a symphony to me. One day, a man named Kirk entered my home to barter for gas. I attacked him with a hammer, killing him. A woman named Pam came in after him. She found my living room strewn with human and animal bones. I grabbed her, impaled her on a meat hook, and dismembered Kirk's body with my chainsaw as Pam watched. Jerry came looking for them both. He found Pam's nearly dead, spasming body in a chest freezer. I killed him with a hammer. Later that night, I ambushed their two surviving friends, Sally and Franklin. I killed Franklin with my chainsaw. I captured Sally and brought her back to the house. We tried to include Grandpa in murdering her with a hammer, but Grandpa's grip was weak, and he kept dropping the hammer repeatedly. Sally broke free and ran onto our road in front of our house, pursued by my family. The truck driver attacks me with a large wrench, injuring me, and escaped on foot. Sally, covered in blood, flags down a passing pickup truck and climbs into the bed, narrowly escaping me. I was so angry I let her get away. My family won't be happy about this.
John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, did not act alone. This TikTok series is about to blow your mind, but there's a lot of information here, so proceed with caution. The case of John Wayne Gacy, the serial killer clown, is one of the most infamous true crime stories in American history. A brief overview of the case: in the 1970s, John Wayne Gacy murdered 33 young men. He buried them in the crawl space beneath his home and his yard, and he was connected to a number of different crimes. Gacy himself gained infamy because he dressed up as Pogo the Clown on the weekends and volunteered at hospitals and children's birthday parties. Now, the official story says that John Wayne Gacy acted completely alone. He had no help in carrying out any of these murders, but I really don't believe that that's the case. Through all of our research that we did for our podcast, we've determined that Gacy was connected to a number of other killers, pedophiles across America. And he even may have been connected to one of America's other most infamous serial killers, the Candyman out of Houston, Texas. So before we get into this, I want to state that I do believe that Gacy did murder some people, and I think he was very complicit in all of this, obviously, but I don't think that he acted alone. But why do I think that? So to start off, we need to talk about Jeffrey Rignall, this guy who was actually a survivor of John Wayne Gacy. After a night of abuse and essay at the hands of John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Rignall was allowed to go free. But what Jeffrey would go on to tell authorities and the media about what happened that night at Gacy's home is a major thing in this whole conspiracy. Now, Jeffrey would tell the police that while Gacy was essaying him, there was another man in the room. Now, whether or not this other man participated in the essaying or they were there to watch, it doesn't matter. Someone was watching this criminal act occur. He knew he could give a description of the guy, and he knew that someone else was there watching this happen. Then we get to Robert Bob Gilroy, who was a victim of John Wayne Gacy. So Robert Gilroy was abducted on September 15th, 1977. That's the official date that he went missing. He was supposed to show up for an event after that day, but he never showed. But John Wayne Gacy's plane tickets and records placed him as being out of the state at the time. His plane tickets from the time show that Gacy left Illinois on September 12th, and he didn't return until September 16th, the day after Robert Gilroy went missing. Already, these two facts point to a larger conspiracy at hand. There may have been people helping procure victims for Gacy, and he may have been even paying for these victims. And that's when we get to Philip Paskey and John David Norman, two of the most horrific people I've ever read about, and this is where the connections with the case start to get really shocking. And we've talked about John David Norman here on my TikTok before. This guy was connected with the higher-ups in the government. This guy had lots of political power, and he was a known pedophile. Remember, in earlier TikToks, I even told you about how John David Norman was arrested multiple times. He had Rolodexes full of index cards of the people who he was supplying these young men to. And both times, the police departments lost the Rolodexes and lost all the names of the abusers. But how did they connect to Gacy? Well, in part 2, we're going to talk about it.
What? Nothing there, mate. Nothing there. What? There's nothing there.
This island has one of the most disturbing histories in America, and no one really knows the full truth behind it. So like I said before, this island was owned by multi-millionaire Francis Sheldon, pictured right here. And Francis and a number of other local men from Michigan, including this guy, Gerald S. Richards, ran a boys' camp on the island. They would fly kids to the island on this airstrip, kids from the YMCA and other schools and communities in the area. And both the children and the parents of the children who attended this boys' camp were told that this was an island of fun where kids could relax. They had big brothers there. It was going to be totally safe. And this camp ran on this island for a period of years. Then one day, some of the kids who attended the camp began to tell their parents that the counselors or the teachers, the adults that were there on the island, had behaved with them in very, very inappropriate ways. They began telling their friends and parents that they were taken into these cabins pictured here on the island. They were assaulted. They were told to remove all of their clothing and that there were cameras all over the place. Well, it turns out that this guy, the multi-millionaire with political and business connections in the area, Francis Sheldon, was running a massive CP ring. And they had been abusing the children on this island under the guise of bringing them to a boys' camp for years, recording all of it, selling it across the world. And some of the more affluent clients of their business were even allowed to take trips to the island themselves to see some of these young boys. Now, this story bears an obvious resemblance to the story of Jeffrey Epstein, but there are some very, very strange things that are happening here that nobody knows about, and the government still refuses to talk about to this day. So let's talk about this guy, Gerald S. Richards. He was a gym teacher at a local Catholic school who went down for the crimes, and he was heavily involved with every aspect of this business, if you know what I mean. Well, it seems like through his political and business connections, Francis Sheldon was actually tipped off that he was about to be arrested and raided and charged with these horrific crimes. So Francis, before he could be brought to justice for these crimes, he actually fled the country in a personal plane. He then moved to France, got remarried, and died in Amsterdam, and never had to pay for any of the crimes that were committed here. But it's when we start talking about the murders that this story really starts to blow my mind. So take a good look at this guy, Chris Bush. This is Christopher Bush's father, Harold Lee Bush. Now, he was an executive with General Motors, and the family was obviously extremely wealthy. They were politically connected, and they were very connected to every business in the area. These guys had a lot of power. But back to Christopher Bush. This guy had assaulted a number of children. He'd been let out of prison, let out of jail in a very, very suspicious way multiple times, put on bail for serious offenses. And he was an alleged associate of the crime ring that was happening on North Fox Island. Meaning that, like I said earlier, he was one of those people who could afford to actually fly out to the island to do things himself. I'm out of time. Follow for part 3. This is where it gets juicy.